Hello, my name is Osha. I like talking about American presidents. Today, I want to talk a little bit about the Mexican repatriation under the administration of President Herbert Herbert Hoover. President Herbert Hoover, who was our 31st president. And of course, I'm going to end up just touching on President Polk as well. The reason I'm talking about the Mexican repatriation is I noticed that, of course, we're living under number 45 and 47. That's President Donald Trump. And there have been all these ICE raids, of course, ICE being Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And there's been the rounding up, the rating of illegal immigrants, and the violation of due process. So under our Constitution, everyone within U.S. jurisdiction is entitled to due process, habeas corpus. You don't have to be a United States citizen or U.S. national to be entitled to due process. It's just in our Constitution. Everyone is entitled to due process of law. If you're accused of a crime, right, if you have charges, then you have a right to your day in court. It applies to everybody. It doesn't matter whatever the charge is, even if you're supposed to be a terrorist. That's already been established. Was it in Rumsfeld versus who was it again? Hamdan, right? So it's the law. It's constitutional. It's a it's that everybody who's accused of a crime is entitled to due process of law. You get to defend yourself in a U.S. court of law, right? And so something that's been making the rounds is a case of Kilmar Abrego Garcia. And I'm not going to dwell on that. You can Google him. But of course, he's someone who was arrested several years ago, and he was accused of being an MS-13 member, and he's denied this. Of course, he's a U.S. permanent resident. He's married to an American citizen, and his kids are Americans. He's lived here for a long time. Now, the thing is that though that he's been imprisoned and deported illegally. Even the government has admitted to an administrative error in deporting him to El Salvador. There have been, I've seen bizarre, news articles and statements that there's an intent to deport. There was an intent to deport him to, various states in Africa where he's not coming, where he's not from. He's never been to, so there's a lot going on that seems just straight out of the arc, very medieval. It doesn't reflect the democratic values and principles of America as a leading, as a model for democracy and good governance, right, and rule of law. So, so he's of Hispanic origin, and of course, I've talked. I'm not going to personalize this particular video because I've talked about how I'm an American citizen, and as of the day I was swatted on May 16, 2023, I was an auditor in the Department of the Navy in the U.S. federal government, and I haven't had a day in court myself. My due process rights have been violated. I was wrongfully detained for almost 3 years, over 15 months, incarcerated wrongfully without a trial on false charges, a bad faith prosecution, malicious and vindictive prosecution. And of course, a judge has stated that Abrego Garcia's case, it manifests a prima facie uh, instance of vindictive prosecution. Prima facie means, at first glance, on the face of it, so in any event, he was deported and brought back to the US, and he's here now. And I saw a video of him going viral on TikTok, and the government administrative officials, senior officials in the DHS, complaining about him being released to do TikTok videos and things like that. And, they're accusing him, they're saying he's a criminal, right? That's Everybody's innocent until proven guilty. If you say somebody is innocent as a dangerous person, as a threat, you prove it in a court of law, right? All that's, just saying it, in the court of public opinion, that's archaic, that's primitive, that's straight out of the ark. That's not what we do in a civilized country, in a country with democratic principles. You go and prove it in a court of law, and it's very concerning. But in any event, what I want to do is show a parallel to what's going on. This is an instance of one person who was merely deported. He's a U.S. national because of permanent resident, um, and he was deported without a trial. Now, again, President Trump is not, he's not the first to do it, and so I wanted to take us back to the era of the Mexican repatriation under President Herbert Hoover. So during the time of the Great Depression, which was, instigated by the stock market crash of 1929, President Hoover, who was a conservative, his panacea for that was to, because so the Great Depression started after the stock market crash, and so 25% of Americans lost their jobs. They were unemployed. There are some states that had as much as 50%, some areas as much as 80% people Americans were unemployed. However, President Hoover's panacea was uh, to use a fig leaf, saying, well, if they that it was immigrants who were taking the jobs of real Americans, of course, being euphemism for white Americans. That's code for white Americans, right? So what he now did was he coerced. He had states. There are states, local government officials, and even big corporations. They worked, they were basically co-opted by the federal government to fire Mexican Americans. So these were Mexican Americans. They weren't just Mexican citizens. These were American citizens. So they fired them, and then these state officials would now started conducting raids in Mexican American communities, right? This was in the 1920s, 1930s. And so between 1929 and 1936, uh, Mexican Americans were blackballed, right? And so they couldn't get any jobs. And then, the governments, local governments, created such a hostile environment for them so that they couldn't work. They had false charges filed against them without due process of law. And so they couldn't work, they couldn't survive. So they created a hostile environment for them and gave them the option to voluntarily self deport, right? And it was called repatriation or remigration. They gave them an option to voluntarily self deport to go to Mexico, even though over 60% of the people who were raided and who were blackballed, who were subjected to the persecution, were actually American citizens. And I'm going to explain how, America itself, the American government created a condition where, we had a lot of people of Mexican descent who were actually American citizens. And so about 60% of the people who were forced to remigrate or were repatriated, these are euphemisms, back to Mexico, a country they were unfamiliar with. 60% of them were American citizens, right? They were American citizens, not even Mexican citizens. They were American citizens. And so, um, President Hoover was trying to use this as a lightning rod, that immigrants were taking Americans' jobs. So 60% of these people, of the Mexicans who were forced to self deport, were not actually immigrants. They were American citizens. They were born in America. They'd never been to Mexico. So, and it's estimated that about 300,000 to 2 million Mexicans were forced to self deport, were repatriated to Mexico during this era between 1929 and 1936, during the period of the Great Depression. Um, so you see, it was horrible. However, just as so it was an unconstitutional deportation, right? The same thing with Abrego Garcia in Kilmar Abrego Garcia's case. It was an unconstitutional deportation. The government admitted in the case of Abrego Garcia that it was an administrative error, but in but as a I don't know how to call it. As to save face, and just something similar to what the government does after uh, doing something so terrible, atrocious, violating human rights, and it takes decades later the U.S. government, or government officials or the state actors then get to apologize for the unconstitutional actions that were perpetrated against American citizens, just like in the case of Korematsu, right? 40 years after Korematsu, in the case of the Japanese internment, the Japanese mass incarceration, mass imprisonment during the World War II, the unconstitutional mass imprisonment. 40 years after Korematsu and the other young men, they were and Endo, who was a young woman, they were vindicated. The actions against them were deemed unconstitutional. Their convictions were overturned. But that happened 40 years after. In the case of the Mexican Americans who were wrongfully deported unconstitutionally, uh, it took about 70 years after when the state of California apologized, and they tried to make amends. The state of California in 2006 acknowledged the unconstitutional deportation. Um, in any event, something I want to do though is to explain how the U.S. government was actually responsible for the Mexican minorities who became American citizens. This started under President James Polk. James Knox Polk was our 11th president. It's interesting. I'm just going to talk quickly, briefly about James Knox Polk's biography. So. Um, James Knox Polk. Most people don't know him, right? Most people don't haven't heard of his of James Knox Polk. However, he's one of the most productive presidents we've ever had. He was a dark horse candidate. He was a protege of Andrew Jackson, and he was from Tennessee. He had been a congressman from Tennessee. He served briefly as a governor, and he was a dark horse candidate, uh, a compromise candidate uh, from the Democratic Party, and he became president, and he had four items on his agenda, right? And he won, and also he planned on having just one term. He believed American presidents. In fact, he tried to establish it that American presidents would only serve one term, but have a term limit of one, just one term, one tenure, one term period. But he wasn't successful in getting that done. But he had four items on his agenda as president, and he accomplished all of them. One of them was to resolve the Oregon Territory, which was in dispute with the British. They were jointly sharing. Uh, they were jointly controlling that territory, and so he wanted that resolved. He also wanted to lower tariffs. He wanted to lower tariffs. What else did he want? He uh, he wanted to create a centralized Federal Reserve System, sort of centralized banking, because he came in during the time of great economic depression, because Andrew Jackson had destroyed the Second National Bank and created his pet banks, and which had left the financial crisis. And of course, President Van Buren was called, President Van Ruin, as because the public accused him of having ruined the economy, even though it was Andrew Jackson who created his pet banks and destroyed the second national bank. So he wanted to, uh, um, what's his name? James Polk, President Polk wanted to he wanted to create a centralized Federal Reserve System, sort of, to replace that banking, the centralized national bank that, it did do a lot of good. So he wanted that, tariffs, Oregon Territory, and what else was it? To The fourth thing was it to get California. He didn't originally. He also had that manifest destiny idea to expand all the way to the Pacific, um, to expand westward. So let me see if I remember. There was a fourth item. He wanted to lower tax tariffs. The thing is, he achieved everything on his agenda. All four items on his agenda. Was it acquisition of California? That was the he wanted to make Texas. He wanted to annex the state of Texas, and that was the first thing he accomplished in his first um, presidency. So Texas became a state, a state in the United States on in December 1945, and so this is how a lot of Mexicans got to be Americans. So Texas had originally been part of Mexico. The United States, many Americans, right, many European Americans, Anglo Saxons, started to move as settlers into Texas, which was a territory within the part of Mexico back then. The United States government started to unofficially encourage these settlers, right, to supported them in declaring Texas uh, a republic. And so the white settlers eventually they did that. They broke away from Mexico, declaring Texas to be an independent republic. This was in 1936. So between 1936 and uh, uh, 1945, 1944, 45, Texas was a republic. And of course, their declaring themselves a republic was just prelude for the United States annexing it, because it was white settlers uh, who rebelled and were seceded from Mexico. So this, of course, created tension between the United States government and Mexico. So James Polk annexed Texas in December 1945. Subsequently, however, Mexico, of course, wanted to get their states. They wanted to get Texas back. Eventually, in any event, the United States went to war with Mexico, and eventually, so there was a Mexican American War. Now, in the war came to an end in 1948 with the Treaty of Guadalupe uh, Hidalgo, and basically, Alta California was ceded to the United States. Of course, the United States defeated Mexico, and 50 through what's called the Mexican Cession, right? In the Mexican Cession, approximately 55% of Mexico, by the end of this war, and with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, about 55% of Mexican territory became part of the United States. Now, the United States gave them, threw them a bone, gave them $15 million. Of course, Mexico was forced to give up its territory, but that's what the United States had a way of doing that. They take your territory, and they throw you a bone in, consideration. That's what they call it in law, to say, well, it was an exchange, it was a transaction. It wasn't like, well, that they just took it, even though they were basically They were basically beaten up. They went to war. They were forced to actually uh, cede their lands, their territories. They didn't really have a choice. But so the United States gave Mexico $15 million for Alta California. So California and a lot of land, including what has become the modern state of Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, Colorado. I might not be able to name all of them. Wyoming, Kansas, uh, a sliver of Oklahoma, New Mexico, if I've mentioned that. So all of these territories, in any event, became part of the United States. And of course, they had people living there. They were Mexicans because they were 55% of Mexico's territory just suddenly became the United States. And this was in 1848, right? So you can see uh, how Mexicans now became part of the United States and automatically became American citizens. So by 1929, right, many of them were citizens of the United States. Of course, we had the 14th Amendment after the the Civil War, which said anyone born in the United States, right, is an American citizen. So, what happened in 1929 under President Hoover, the Mexican repatriation, was unconstitutional. It was an egregious, violation of rights of American citizens, just to create jobs, vacancies, and jobs that white Americans could fill up due to you know, to the Great Depression. So, and you can see it's unfortunate that uh, with the changing you know demographic composition of the United States, uh, there's a nativist angst, that's sort of propelling, that's sort of instigating the ICE raids and the calls for deportations, massive deportations, including the unconstitutional deportations, and uh, what's happened to Abrego Garcia. Now, if a U.S. citizen or a U.S. national, if they're committing crimes, they go through the courts, due process, and they go to jail. You don't when a white American uh, or an American of Anglo-Saxon descent kills somebody, they don't deport him back to England, right? When he commits heinous crimes, they don't deport him to England. They don't deport them to Scotland, right? Why is it that people born in America charged with crimes, they haven't even gone through a legal process? Why are there calls to deport them to 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 nations that they left ages ago, or nations that their ancestors came from? So you see that those are xenophobic and racist elements still within our society. And this, hopefully this will be resolved, and that more perfect union that our founding fathers, the framers, hoped for and enshrined in our Constitution, those ideals and values, will be realized. So I hope I've been able to discuss. Yeah, I think I've pretty much touched everything I wanted to talk about concerning the Mexican repatriation that happened between 1929 and 1936, and the origin of how um, Mexicans became American citizens, and the injustice that was done to them during the Great Depression, when President Herbert Hoover and local authorities uh, collaborated and uh, created a hostile environment and basically gave one-way tickets to uh, um, Mexican descent Americans, you know, to go back to Mexico, just as as an expedient to address the Great Depression and create vacancies and employment for white Americans during the Great Depression. My name is Olurotimi Osha. I like talking about American presidents, and today I basically talked about the actions of President James Polk uh, and President Herbert Hoover. James Polk was our 11th president, and Herbert Hoover was our 31st president. And I will keep you posted. Thank you.